What if the strangest thing time can do isn't travel forward or backward, but hesitate? Most of us move through our days like passengers on a train with tinted windows. We feel motion, we mark the stops, we assume the tracks are fixed. Morning becomes afternoon. A calendar page turns, and whatever we missed, we tell ourselves, belongs to yesterday. But every so often, someone describes an experience so oddly specific it refuses to fit inside the usual boxes. Not a dream, not a metaphor. A day that repeats with the precision of a metronome. The same coffee spilled at the same minute. The same phrase spoken by a stranger at the same second. A moment replayed so faithfully that the mind, which is built to accept patterns, begins to revolt. The story always begins in an ordinary place, a commuter platform, slick with rain and fluorescent light, a hospital corridor that smells like disinfectant and exhaustion, a wedding morning, all white fabric and borrowed jewelry and nerves, a classroom clock ticking toward the bell, a stretch of highway at 2:30 a.m., where the world narrows to headlights and an exit sign, a coffee shop before sunrise, the first espresso hissing to life. None of these settings are exotic. That's part of the unease. If time can slip its leash, it doesn't need a stormy laboratory or a cosmic event. It can happen in the middle of a Tuesday, and in these accounts, Tuesday becomes a kind of cage. At first, the person trapped inside the repetition assumes the safest explanation: déjà vu, fatigue, stress, a brain glitch, a memory that misfired. But then it happens again, exactly again. They predict a dropped newspaper before it hits the floor. They hear an announcement before the loudspeaker crackles. They watch an accident unfold and then find themselves, impossibly, 5 minutes earlier, with a second chance and a tightening throat. What's most unsettling isn't the repetition itself. It's the loneliness of it. Everyone else in the loop moves like they've always moved. They laugh, complain, hurry, hesitate, forget. They aren't actors. They aren't puppets. They are simply unaware. From their perspective, it is the first time. From the trapped person's perspective, it is the 5th or the 12th or the 43rd. A private apocalypse of familiarity. Some people try to break the pattern by force. They change routines. They miss trains. They skip work. They refuse to do the thing that happened last time. But the morning still resets. The same alarm. The same light through the blinds. The same messages waiting on the phone like nothing has happened at all. Other people try to break it by surrender. They pay attention. They stop treating the loop as a puzzle to beat and start treating it as a scene to understand. They notice what they overlooked: a teenager too close to a platform edge, a wound that seemed minor, a conversation avoided for years, a hungry man at a locked door, a memorial on the roadside, a small disaster that always happens for a reason. In these stories, repetition isn't random. It behaves like a question. Not a question asked by a scientist in a lab, but a question asked by life itself, in the language of small moments. Will you notice? Will you act? Will you finally say what needs to be said? Will you choose differently when you are given the same choice again? There's no proof that any of this occurred. The journals vanish. The footage behaves impossibly. The witnesses remember nothing. The people who lived the loops can't offer a clean explanation. Only the certainty of experience. The kind of certainty that changes how you walk through a day even after time begins to behave again. And yet, whether these loops are fractures in physics, storms in the mind, or something we don't have the vocabulary for, They point toward the same human truth. We spend much of our lives repeating ourselves without realizing it. We wake, we rush, we react, we ignore, we postpone. We tell ourselves there will be time later. But what if later isn't guaranteed? What if the universe, the brain, or conscience has a way of holding us in place until we understand what we're avoiding? If time ever did repeat even once, would you recognize the moment you were meant to change? Or would you live the same day again, certain it was ordinary, until the day taught you how to move forward? Have you ever known what someone was about to do before they did it? So clearly it felt like you'd already watched the scene? David Shaw didn't ask for miracles. He asked for a normal Tuesday. London, 2009. Dawn smeared grey across the windows of a modest flat. The alarm rang at 6:30 a.m., the same harsh chirp he'd heard 1,000 times. He showered on autopilot, dressed in the same careful layers, and stepped into the familiar rhythm of commute and obligation. The city carried him like a current. Pavement, stairwell, ticket gate, platform. Then the day began to repeat. At first, the feeling was mild, almost comforting, like hearing a song you'd forgotten you loved. A woman in a red coat shifted her bag. A man in a crisp suit flipped open a newspaper. An overhead announcement warned of delays. The timing felt uncanny, but David filed it under the brain's habit of pattern making. Stress can make the mind echo itself. Lack of sleep can smear yesterday into today, but the second time didn't feel like déjà vu. It felt like a rerun. The same woman spilled her coffee at the same minute. The same paper slipped from the same man's hands at the same stop. The same phrase, exactly the same, leaked from someone's phone conversation behind him. When the train lurched, an elderly passenger stumbled in the same direction, grabbing the same pole, wincing in the same way. David's stomach tightened with a very specific kind of fear, the kind you feel when reality stops improvising. By the fifth repetition, prediction became a curse. He could speak seconds before others spoke, not because he wanted to, but because his body was trying to prove to itself it wasn't hallucinating. He watched his own thoughts turn into a checklist. Coffee spill, delay announcement, stumble, the briefcase man's laugh, the squeal of brakes, the faint cough 2 doors down. It didn't help that nobody else noticed. His wife kissed him goodbye each morning with the same sleepy tenderness, unaware that this was not the first time she'd done it. Co-workers complained about the same emails as though they were brand new. Strangers on the train made the same jokes and sighed the same sighs, their faces sincere, their eyes untroubled. When David tried to explain, carefully at first, then with growing urgency, people looked at him the way you look at someone speaking through a fever. So he began to test the edges of the world. On one loop, he missed the train on purpose, waiting for the next one like a scientist changing a single variable. The next morning, he woke to the same alarm, the same light through the curtains, the same Tuesday beginning again as if his experiment had never occurred. On another loop, he didn't go to work at all. He stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the city outside. It didn't matter. The reset came anyway, clean and indifferent. Eventually, the repetition stopped being merely frightening and became psychologically exhausting. 19 times, David lived the same morning like a line of film threaded through a projector, the frames snapping into the same order no matter how he tried to splice them. And then, on one of the later loops, a small detail began to bruise the script. A homeless man near the station, someone David had never really seen, only registered as part of the scenery, looked directly at him. Not the unfocused gaze of a passerby, not the vacant stare of someone lost in their own hunger. This was a look that seemed to land on David as if the man recognized him. In the repetition, that look became a fixed point. David began to notice how he, too, had been repeating something long before time itself began repeating him. The habit of not looking back. The habit of hurrying past discomfort. The habit of treating other people's suffering as background noise to his own schedule. In a day that kept restarting, small choices suddenly carried enormous weight. If you can't change the outcome by fleeing, maybe you change it by paying attention. If you can't outrun the loop, maybe the loop is asking you to slow down. When Wednesday finally arrived, it wasn't fireworks. It was just a new morning, the kind everyone else takes for granted. But David's life had been quietly rearranged by a single question the loop left behind. If time ever forces you to relive a moment, what is it hoping you'll finally see? What if the loop isn't a prison at all? What if it's a warning you're allowed to understand only by living it twice? In 2013, in a small town where the days moved with the slow confidence of routine, a woman named Zoe felt time snag like fabric on a nail. It wasn't dramatic at first. No thunder, no blackout, no swelling music. Just a morning that felt overly familiar, as if she'd already walked through it once and forgotten to remember. She brushed her teeth and tasted the same minty bite. She glanced at her phone and saw the same message. She stepped outside and noticed the same neighbor wrestling the lid off a trash bin. A dog barked 3 times from the same yard, each bark spaced by the same lazy pauses. Déjà vu is supposed to be fleeting, a shimmer. This didn't shimmer. It settled. By the time Zoe got into her car, the feeling had sharpened into something almost physical. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel. Her eyes moved ahead with the suspicious focus of someone crossing ice. She knew the road. She'd driven it for years. But that day, the road seemed to know her back. Every turn arrived like a line she could recite. Every traffic light changed the way she expected. Every driver behaved as if obeying choreography. Then, as she approached a familiar intersection, her mind flashed a scene that hadn't happened yet. An image so clear it felt like a memory. A blue sedan, ignoring the stop sign, a split second of metallic violence. The crack of impact, the sudden quiet that follows shock. Her foot slammed the brake. The blue sedan blew through the stop sign exactly as she'd remembered. It passed inches from her bumper, close enough that Zoe could see the driver's startled face. She sat in the stillness after, heart hammering like it wanted to escape. She could smell the warmed rubber of sudden braking. She could hear in the distance birds still arguing in the trees, unimpressed by human near misses. She waited there longer than necessary, letting the adrenaline drain. But as she finally pulled forward, a thought pierced through the relief. If she hadn't stopped, if she had obeyed her usual rhythm, she would have been hit. And if that premonition had been a memory, then somewhere, somehow, she had been. That night, she went to bed expecting the world to make sense again in the morning. Instead, she woke up to the same day, the same message, the same trash bin, the same dog barking 3 times in the same yard, the same mint and the same neighbor and the same weather that felt like it had been printed twice. A loop. Zoe tested it the way all of us would. She tried to disrupt the pattern. She drove a different route. She lingered in the kitchen. She called a friend and told them something bizarre was happening, half joking, because saying it plainly felt too fragile. And yet the day marched toward the intersection like a magnet pulling iron filings into place. She could feel the accident waiting for her, the way you can feel a storm before you see it. This time, she approached the crossing more carefully, scanning both sides, slowing early, refusing to be surprised. Again, the blue sedan surged through, reckless and blind. Again, she avoided the collision. But the second escape didn't bring relief. It brought dread, because the loop wasn't just saving her, it was showing her the shape of danger. And danger, once seen, has a way of expanding. On the third run of the day, Zoe tried something different. She parked and waited near the intersection. She watched the flow of cars, like a watcher of tides. She noticed how normal everything looked. How the crash, in the original timeline, if there was such a thing, would have seemed like one more unfortunate headline, one more brief tragedy in the local news. But now she was seeing the hidden architecture of it. Timing, impatience, a rushed driver, a fraction of a second. When the blue sedan appeared, Zoe stepped forward and waved her arms, a ridiculous gesture under an ordinary sky. The driver slowed, confused. The moment of collision dissolved into a moment of irritation instead. A horn blared. Someone shouted. Life continued. And later, hours later, when the loop finally released her into the next day, Zoe realized what had happened wasn't only about her survival. It was about her noticing that tragedy is often made from ordinary pieces. Habit, hurry, distraction, and the belief that tomorrow will always arrive to fix what today breaks. Maybe time loops, if they exist, aren't designed to trap us. Maybe they're designed to teach us what our first life through a moment was too fast to learn. And if that's true, a harder question follows. How many disasters do we repeat simply because no loop arrives to slow us down? What if a loop doesn't announce itself with repetition? What if it announces itself with escape? A man named Ben remembered the sound first. Not the sound you'd expect to define a life-changing day. No explosion, no scream. Just the soft, rhythmic click of a turn signal and the faint rattle of something loose in the passenger side door. Small noises you only notice when your mind has no bigger threat to track. It was late afternoon, the kind where sunlight makes the world look kinder than it is. Ben was driving a familiar road, thinking about nothing in particular. Errands, dinner, the usual quiet math of adulthood. He rounded a bend he'd rounded 100 times, and for a split second, the horizon didn't match his memory. A truck was in his lane. The moment stretched, elastic and impossible. There was no time to swerve, no space, no heroic maneuver, only the raw, animal certainty that impact was coming, and that his body, this fragile instrument of nerves and bone, was about to be rewritten. He braced, not by choice, but by instinct. His hands clamped the wheel, his jaw locked. His eyes stayed open, because even closing them felt like surrendering the last sliver of control. Then, nothing. Not nothing as in darkness. Not nothing as in relief. Nothing as in a hard cut, like a film splice snapping back to an earlier scene. He was suddenly several minutes behind the bend, cruising toward the same stretch of road, the same sunlight, the same turn signal clicking with its steady, indifferent rhythm. The rattle in the door was there again, exactly the same. The air smelled the same. His hands held the wheel the same way, except they were sweating now, and his heart was sprinting. Ben blinked. Once. Twice. He checked the mirrors. He looked down at the speedometer as if numbers could anchor him. He glanced at the clock, and then, as he approached the bend, the truck appeared again in his lane, as if it had been waiting for its cue. This time, Ben didn't freeze. He moved. He hit the brakes early, harder than was reasonable, letting the car slow before the curve swallowed his sightline. The truck roared through the bend. Still wrong, still terrifying, but now it passed him with a wide margin, missing him by the distance created by one altered choice. His car shuddered to a stop on the shoulder. His breath came in sharp, bright gulps. His limbs trembled, angry with adrenaline. He was alive in a way that felt like it had been negotiated, not granted. And yet, survival didn't feel clean. It felt haunted, because the mind doesn't accept a second chance without asking what it means. Ben wasn't just shaken by the near collision. He was shaken by the implication that the collision had already happened once, somewhere, in some version of the day that had been erased from the world, but not from him. He drove home slower than he'd ever driven, as if carefulness could make the universe predictable again. He tried to explain the experience to himself with normal words. Maybe he'd blacked out. Maybe he'd imagined it. Maybe stress had created a false memory so vivid it masqueraded as reality. But the details refused to dissolve. The turn signals click, the door rattle, the angle of sunlight on the dashboard, the exact shape of the truck's grille as it filled his windshield. A loop, if that's what it was, had not repeated the whole day. It had repeated a small slice, the segment that mattered. That's what makes stories like Ben's difficult to hold. They don't behave like fantasy. They behave like emergency procedures, like time itself performed a drill. Here is the moment you die. Now here is the moment you learn. And if that sounds too grand, it's worth noticing how quietly it can change a person. Ben started leaving earlier for drives. He stopped shaving seconds off yellow lights. He became, in the eyes of others, a slightly more cautious man. But inside, he carried something else. The sensation that life had been briefly edited, not by him, but for him. Sometimes he would sit in traffic and look at strangers through windshields, faces lit by phones, brows furrowed, jaws clenched, and wonder how many of them had come within an inch of disaster without ever knowing it. How many near misses were really near misses, and how many were collisions we simply didn't have to remember. Because if time can reset a fatal moment, even once, it forces a question that sounds philosophical but is painfully practical. How many warnings do we ignore simply because they arrive only as ordinary seconds? What if a loop isn't about saving you from death? What if it's about saving you from the person you become when you think death is far away? There was a stretch of years when a man named Sean measured his life in deadlines. He was good at it, too. Meetings stacked like plates, emails arriving faster than he could answer them, the constant itch of being behind, and the strange pride of enduring it. His friends joked that he lived on coffee and urgency. Sean laughed along, because laughter was easier than admitting he didn't know how to slow down. Then one morning, time stopped cooperating. It began with a train, the same one he always took, same platform, same chill, same tired faces welded together by routine. The speaker crackled with a minor service announcement. A woman adjusted her scarf. A teenager bounced a knee in nervous rhythm. The train arrived with its familiar rush of wind and metallic groan. Sean stepped aboard, found his usual spot, opened his phone, scrolled, 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 and then, without warning, without sound, he was back on the platform again. At first, he thought he'd missed a stop or nodded off, but the announcement was the same, down to the oddly cheerful emphasis on the word short. The woman adjusted her scarf in the same nervous way, like she couldn't decide whether she was too warm or too cold. The teenager's knee bounced in the same tempo, a small metronome of impatience. The train arrived again. Sean's pulse tightened. His eyes darted. His skin prickled with that instinctive alarm the body reserves for predators and cliff edges. He boarded again, and again he was returned to the platform, as if the universe was refusing to let him leave. 3 times. 5, 10. It didn't repeat the entire day. It repeated the commute, the corridor between home and work, between private self and public performance. The slice of life he treated like a tunnel. Endure it, and you get to the part that matters. Except now, the tunnel had no exit. On the 11th loop, Sean tried to change something obvious. He stood on the opposite end of the platform. He boarded a different car. He refused to look at his phone. He stared at people's faces instead, searching for a glitch, a sign, a clue that someone else felt the repetition too. No one did. They moved in their ordinary grooves, untroubled by the fact that Sean had watched them do it over and over. The woman still adjusted her scarf. The teenager still bounced his knee. A man in a tan coat still coughed into his elbow at the same moment, as if the cough belonged to the air. In repetition, ordinary life becomes uncanny, not because it's wrong, but because it's precise. Sean began to notice details he'd never noticed. A smear of paint on a pillar, the way dust swirled near a vent, a tiny tear in an advertisement poster, the pattern of cracks in the platform tiles like dry riverbeds. He noticed the tiredness on people's faces, not as background, but as a common weather they were all enduring. Then, on one loop, the teenager stood up too quickly. Sean saw it a second before it happened. The kid's foot slipped near the edge, his arms pinwheeled. His body tilted toward the tracks, toward the arriving train and the cold inevitability of steel. Time didn't slow. Sean did. He lunged, grabbed the teenager's jacket, yanked him back. They stumbled together, breathless, startled, alive. The teenager stared at him, wide-eyed, mouth open with a wordless question. Sean muttered something clumsy, careful, or watch your step, because humans reach for small language when faced with big outcomes. The teenager nodded, shaken, and then, like the world had been waiting for that gesture, the loop loosened. The train arrived. Sean boarded. The doors closed. The city began to move forward again. At work, the day continued like nothing extraordinary had happened. People argued over spreadsheets. The coffee machine sputtered. Someone complained about the weather. Sean nodded, answered, performed. But inside, something had shifted. The loop hadn't been about changing trains or finding secret switches. In reality, it had been about interrupting a moment that, to everyone else, would have become a tragedy explained later in hindsight. A slip, a freak accident, a sad story on the evening news. Sean sat at his desk and realized the most unsettling part. He had taken that platform 100 times without looking up, without noticing the edge, without noticing the people, without imagining that a life could change in the space of one misstep. Time had repeated until he finally paid attention. And if that's true, it leaves an uncomfortable question humming beneath the surface of our own routines. How many times do we walk past the edge of something important, someone's fear, someone's loneliness, someone's danger, before we finally look up and reach out? What if the loop doesn't happen in a city at all? What if it happens in a place so quiet you can hear your own thoughts echo? A woman named Jessica drove into the mountains to escape noise. Not noise in the simple sense, traffic, screens, the constant chatter of other people's lives, but the noise of her own. The kind that accumulates after a hard year, when grief and responsibility and exhaustion stack up so high you can't see over them. She rented a small cabin, with creaking floors and a porch that looked out over pine trees. She brought groceries, a paperback she'd been meaning to read, and the promise she made to herself. 2 days of silence. The first morning was exactly what she'd hoped for. Sunlight fell through the trees in clean stripes. A bird tapped at the window like it was checking in. The kettle hissed. She wrapped her hands around a mug and watched steam rise and vanish, the simplest proof that things can change forms and still be themselves. Then the day repeated. At first, Jessica didn't realize. She noticed only that the bird tapped at the window again. The same pattern, the same insistence. She heard the kettle hiss with a familiarity that felt overly scripted. When she checked her phone, mostly out of habit, even though she'd promised herself she wouldn't, she saw the same notification she'd dismissed earlier. Same timestamp. Same little red icon that should not have returned. She told herself it was normal. Cabin mornings can blur, so can stress, so can a mind starving for rest. But then she saw the water spill. It happened in the same place, in the same shape, like a small silver accident repeating its choreography on the wooden counter. Jessica froze with a towel in her hands, staring at the puddle as if it were a message written in a language she didn't want to learn. Later, she stepped onto the porch and heard the same distant sound of a truck on the road, a low growl that rose and fell. She looked out and saw a deer appear between the trees, pausing the same way, ears twitching the same way, before slipping back into green shadow. When the afternoon came, it brought the same clouds. When evening came, it brought the same pale wash of light. When she tried to fall asleep, the same wind nudged the same loose branch against the side of the cabin. A soft knock that sounded like someone trying to be let in. Jessica woke the next morning to the same morning. Same bird, same kettle, same steam, same strange sense of being returned to the beginning like a cursor blinking at the top of a page. Unlike the city loops, train platforms, intersections, crowded commutes, this one felt intensely personal. There were no witnesses, no strangers to reassure her by their normalness. Just her, and a mountain that didn't care whether her day was repeating. In isolation, the mind becomes louder. Jessica wondered if she was unraveling, if grief had finally bent something inside her that was supposed to be straight. She tried to ground herself with facts. Her name, the year, the reason she was here. She wrote notes in a journal, leaving them open on the table like breadcrumbs for the next version of herself. The notes stayed. That, more than anything, chilled her, because it meant she wasn't simply forgetting. Something was looping, and something was carrying forward. She began to treat the day like a room she had to map. What repeats? What changes? Where are the seams? She tested small choices first. She made tea instead of coffee. She stood in a different place when the bird arrived. She left the water running longer. She walked down the trail earlier or later or not at all. The loop adjusted around her like a fabric that wanted to fall back into its original folds. But the notes in the journal gave her a strange kind of leverage. Not over time, but over herself. Each time she woke again to the same morning, she read what she'd written and felt less alone. She wasn't trapped with a stranger in her own body. She was trapped with a collaborator. Yesterday's Jessica speaking across the reset. By the fourth loop, a new pattern emerged. Each day, around dusk, Jessica felt a swell of dread she couldn't explain, a pressure in her chest, a tightening in her throat, like the air itself was warning her. She began to anticipate it, and anticipation made it worse. The dread peaked at the same time each loop, as precise as the bird's tapping. On the fifth loop, she followed the dread instead of fighting it. She sat on the porch as the light dimmed and listened. The wind, the branches, the distant hush of the forest. And then, beneath those sounds, something else. Faint, irregular, human. A voice? A call? It was so subtle she might have missed it in a normal life. Jessica stood. The sound came again, clearer this time. A shout, swallowed by distance. Not threatening, not angry, just desperate. Someone was out there. She grabbed a flashlight and ran down the path, stumbling over routes she'd already memorized from previous loops. The forest thickened, and the air smelled of damp earth and resin. The sound returned, in fragments, like a signal struggling through static. When she found him, he was lying in a shallow dip off the trail, his ankle twisted, his face pale with pain and fear. A hiker, alone, stranded, trying not to panic. The kind of incident that, in a normal world, might end badly if no one happened to pass. But Jessica had passed before, again and again. This time, she stayed. She spoke calmly. She called for help with the stubborn patience of someone who had practiced this moment without knowing it. She steadied him, reassured him, kept him awake, and focused until rescue arrived. The next morning, the sun rose into a different day. Jessica sat at the cabin table with her journal open, her hands wrapped around a mug, and realized the loop had not been a punishment. It had been a spotlight, a chance to listen long enough to hear what she'd been too overwhelmed to hear. Not her own noise, but someone else's need. And if time ever does repeat, whether through physics or psychology or some merciful glitch, maybe its quiet message is this. In the silence, we sometimes discover we were never meant to escape the world, only to return to it with our attention restored. What if the loop doesn't arrive as a full day, or even an hour? What if it's only a handful of seconds, repeating until you finally understand what they're for? A man named Michael first noticed it in a doorway. Not a mystical doorway, just the narrow threshold between a grocery store and its parking lot. The kind of place you don't remember 5 minutes after leaving, because it's designed to move you through, not invite you to stay. He had a basket in one hand and a receipt in the other. The air inside smelled like detergent and overripe fruit. The air outside tasted like summer asphalt. As he pushed the glass door open, he heard a cart rattle behind him, then a sharp, childlike laugh, and then, snap. He was back inside the store, his hand on the door handle again. The same smell of detergent, the same basket weight pulling his wrist down, the same receipt folded in the same careless way. Michael blinked, half expecting someone to shout, "Cut!" like he was on a set. But no one reacted. A cashier scanned items with bored efficiency. A man argued quietly on his phone. The fluorescent lights hummed with their steady, indifferent buzz. Michael stepped forward again. Cart rattle, child laugh, snap. Back to the handle, back to the smell, back to the same moment stitched together with too perfect thread. It wasn't like the stories where people relive entire mornings or days. This was smaller, tighter, more surgical, like time had put a finger on a specific scene and refused to let it pass. By the fifth repetition, the fear changed shape. It stopped being a spike and became a pressure. The kind of pressure you feel when you realize the rules might have exceptions, and nobody ever taught you what to do when the exceptions appear. He tried to break it with logic. He waited longer before opening the door. Snap! He switched hands. Snap! He turned around and walked deeper into the aisles. Snap! Back at the handle, as if the world had rewound him like a toy. Then he tried to break it with surrender. He stood still and listened. The store's background music, the squeak of rubber soles, the faint rustle of plastic bags. He watched the people around him with a new intensity, hunting for the reason he was being pinned to this moment. Each loop had the same choreography. Cart rattle behind him, child laugh, a woman's voice saying, "Hey, careful," and then the snap that yanked him back. Careful became a clue, a warning, the only line that sounded like it belonged to someone paying attention. On the ninth loop, Michael turned before opening the door. A little boy, maybe 4 or 5, was riding the edge of a cart like it was a playground, his hands gripping the metal frame while an adult pushed him absent-mindedly, eyes on a phone. The boy's laughter was bright and pure, the way children laugh when they trust the world to catch them. But Michael saw something else. He saw the cartwheel wobble. He saw the child shift his weight at the wrong angle. He saw, with the certainty of repetition, the coming fall, the small body tipping, the head too close to the hard tile, the kind of accident that happens in a blink and then lives forever in someone's memory. In the first version of the scene, Michael had been facing outward, ready to leave. He would have heard the laugh and kept walking. In the first version, if there was such a thing, he might have missed the moment entirely. But now he couldn't miss it. Time wouldn't let him. On the next loop, he acted before his mind could argue. As the cart approached, he stepped in, palm out, not grabbing the child, but steadying the cart with a gentle firmness. He smiled at the boy, making eye contact, giving him a tiny, friendly, "Hey, buddy," like this was normal, like adults step in all the time. The adult finally looked up, startled then embarrassed. The woman nearby, the one who always said, "Careful," exhaled as if she'd been holding her breath for several loops too, even if she didn't know it. Michael didn't scold. He didn't lecture. He just helped the boy climb down properly, then let the moment soften back into the ordinary flow of life. And then, for the first time, the door opened and the world didn't snap. Michael stepped into the parking lot, sunlight flooding his eyes. The heat pressed against his skin. The sounds outside were wide and messy and unrepeatable. A car engine starting, a distant dog barking, a gust of wind tugging at a stray napkin. He stood there longer than necessary, feeling the fragile relief of forward motion. Later, he would try to explain the experience to himself, and his explanations would be imperfect because the mind loves to build cages out of certainty. But the feeling that stayed with him wasn't scientific, it was human. It was the realization that sometimes the smallest moments are the ones that carry the most weight. So small, you only recognize them when you're forced to live them twice. And if time never loops for us, if it never offers a reset, never hands us a second look, then the question becomes even sharper. How often do we walk through doorways without noticing who might need us to pause? What if time doesn't repeat because something is broken? What if it repeats because something is unfinished? A man named Daniel started calling it the hour. He didn't mean it poetically. He meant it literally. 60 minutes that returned like a tide, over and over, no matter what he did. It began on a Friday night that should have been forgettable. A cheap takeout dinner, a half-watched movie, a restless urge to go for a drive, even though he didn't need anything. He told himself it was harmless, the way people tell themselves harmless things when they don't want to admit they're lonely. The road was mostly empty. Streetlights flickered in long intervals, turning the world into alternating bands of clarity and shadow. Daniel drove without destination, just following the quiet. Then he noticed the clock. 10:17 p.m. He glanced up later. Still 10:17. Not still as in I misread it. Still as in the minute had refused to become the next minute. He looked at his dashboard clock. He checked his phone. Both said 10:17. He laughed once, an automatic disbelieving sound, and the laugh died halfway through. A few seconds later, the digital numbers changed. 10:18. Relief surged, and with it embarrassment. See? Nothing mystical. Just a glitch. Just nerves. But then, without warning, he was back at 10:17. Not the number, the moment. The same stretch of road. The same song fragment on the radio. The same flicker of a streetlight that made the windshield briefly mirror his own face back at him. His hands were in the same position on the wheel. The air smelled the same, faintly sweet, from the car's aging upholstery. Daniel's stomach dropped as if gravity had briefly increased. He drove forward again. He watched the seconds crawl. He told himself he would force the minute to change by sheer will. 10:17 became 10:18. Then the world snapped back again. At first, he assumed he was having some kind of episode, a seizure, a dissociative break, a sleep-deprived hallucination. He pulled into a parking lot and got out of the car, letting cold night air slap him awake. He stared at the storefront windows, the reflected streetlights, his own breath blooming white. 10:17. He checked his phone again. The same number stared back. And then he was in the car again, driving the same road, as if the parking lot had never existed. That's when he understood. He wasn't repeating time by choice. He was being carried back into it. After several loops, fear became something more complicated. It became strategy. Daniel began to treat the hour like a puzzle that required humility. He paid attention to what repeated perfectly and what shifted slightly, the angle of a passing car, the timing of a distant siren, the subtle difference in his own thoughts. One detail remained constant. A particular intersection ahead, controlled by a long light and a blind curve. Every loop, Daniel approached it. Every loop, he felt a tightening in his chest before he reached it, like his body knew what his mind didn't want to admit. Finally, on what might have been the 15th repetition, Daniel saw it. A woman crossing late, a car accelerating too early, a flash of headlights, the terrible choreography of distraction and impatience converging on one fragile human body. In the first run, if there was a first run, Daniel didn't have time to process. He only heard the impact, a sound like a heavy book dropped on a hard floor, but louder and final. A scream, a horn blaring, too late. Then, as always, the hour reset. 10:17. The woman was alive again. The car was farther back. The intersection waited in its ordinary disguise. Daniel's throat went dry. He realized he'd been given what nobody gets in real life: rehearsal for a tragedy. And rehearsal creates responsibility. The next time he approached the intersection, he did something he would have considered ridiculous in any normal hour. He honked early, long and sharp, before anything happened. The sound cut through the night like a knife. The woman paused mid-step, startled, turning her head toward the noise. The accelerating car hesitated, the driver's foot lifting off the gas. The moment wobbled. The collision didn't land, but the loop reset anyway. 10:17. Daniel's hands shook on the wheel. He realized one intervention wasn't enough. The hour wasn't releasing him because the near miss wasn't the point. Something else was. On the next loop, Daniel parked near the intersection and ran to the corner. He stood where the woman would cross. He watched the flow of cars. He became, for a strange span of repeated time, a kind of guardian of a moment nobody else knew was fragile. When the woman approached, Daniel spoke, calm, gentle, almost casual. "Hey, I think the light's tricky here. Mind waiting a second?" She frowned, confused. Then she shrugged, stepped back. The car that would have struck her shot through the intersection a second later, too fast, oblivious, disappearing into the night. The woman looked at Daniel again, then at the fading taillights. Her expression shifted from annoyance to something quieter. "Oh," she said. Just that. A single syllable, heavy with possibility. And then, at last, the hour let go. 10:19, 10:20, 10:21. Time moved like it always did, as if it had never paused. Daniel drove home under streetlights that no longer felt like stage cues. He sat on his couch, staring at nothing, feeling the aftershock of responsibility in his bones. If the loop was real, he had saved a stranger without her ever knowing what she'd escaped. If it wasn't real, then his mind had forced him to confront a deeper truth, that most tragedies are preventable. But prevention requires a kind of attention we rarely practice. Either way, Daniel couldn't unlearn what the hour taught him. If you are given the chance to redo a moment, it is almost never for your convenience. It is for someone's life. What if the loop isn't centered on an accident at all? What if it's centered on a conversation you keep avoiding? A woman named Claire had a habit of postponing the hard things, not out of cruelty, out of exhaustion. She was the kind of person who could keep a room calm, who could smooth over arguments with humor, who could juggle work and family and still remember birthdays. Her life was full of small competencies, and the world rewarded those. But the reward came with a cost. She became the person people leaned on, and leaning, she learned, is heavy. One winter morning, she woke before the alarm, staring at the pale ceiling. Her phone buzzed with a message from her sister. "Can you call me today? It's about Mum." Claire stared at the words for a long time. She felt the familiar reflex rise, the one that says, "Not now, later, after coffee, after work, when I have more energy." She typed back, "Of course, I'll call after lunch." Then the day happened. Coffee, emails, meetings, small talk, a quick grocery run, a laugh at something that wasn't really funny. All the usual life that fills the spaces between the things that matter. At lunch, she glanced at her phone and felt a sting of guilt. She didn't call. She told herself she would after her next meeting. After the meeting, she didn't call. She told herself she would after the next task. By late afternoon, the sky had dimmed into that early darkness winter loves. Claire drove home with the radio low, thinking about dinner, thinking about chores, thinking about anything except the message waiting for her. At 6:10 p.m., she walked into her kitchen and dropped her keys on the counter. The sound was sharp and final in the quiet house. Then, she woke up to the pale ceiling again. The same message buzzed on her phone. "Can you call me today? It's about Mum." Claire sat up so fast the room tilted. Her mouth went dry. She checked the time. Same morning, same date, same winter light crawling through the blinds. She read the message again, expecting it to change, to reveal a joke, a mistake, a glitch. It didn't. She moved through the morning in a daze, half convinced she was dreaming. She made coffee and watched steam rise like a question mark. She drove to work and recognized every red light before it happened. She heard the same co-worker complain about the same small annoyance with the same tone of bored outrage. At lunch, she called her sister immediately. No answer. She tried again. Voicemail. Claire's pulse tightened. She checked the message thread. It was there, like a stone at the bottom of a pond. She tried to text, "I'm calling now. Are you okay?" No reply. The day continued, and Claire couldn't shake the sense that something was waiting at its end. Like a door she had avoided for years was finally being forced open. At 6:10 p.m., she walked into her kitchen and dropped her keys on the counter. Snap. Pale ceiling. Same message, same day. Now she understood. This wasn't random. This wasn't an accident loop. This was a message loop. A loop built around a single act she kept postponing. On the third run of the day, Claire drove to her sister's house instead of going to work. She gripped the steering wheel so hard, her knuckles ached. She rehearsed what she would say, how she would apologize for not calling sooner, how she would ask what was wrong without sounding afraid. Her sister's car was in the driveway. The curtains were half drawn. Claire knocked. No answer. She knocked again. Harder. Still nothing. She felt panic gather behind her ribs like rising water. She tried the door. Locked. She called again. Voicemail. Claire stood there on the porch as cold air pressed against her face, realizing with a kind of grief she couldn't yet name that the loop might not be giving her access to her sister at all. It might be giving her access to herself, forcing her to confront the weight of delay. On the fourth loop, she went to her mother's house. Her mother opened the door in a robe, hair messy, face lined with sleep. She looked surprised to see Claire so early. "Honey, what's going on?" Claire tried to speak. Her throat tightened. The words came out broken. Are you okay?" Her mother smiled gently, like Claire was a child again. "I'm fine. Just tired. Come in." Inside, the house smelled like familiar detergent and old books. Claire sat at the kitchen table and watched her mother move around, humming softly, pouring tea. Everything looked normal. Too normal. Claire's phone buzzed again. A new message, this time from her sister. "Call me as soon as you can, please." Claire turned her phone face down, then flipped it back over, then stared at it like it might explode. She stood so abruptly, the chair scraped the floor. "Mom," she said, voice shaking, "I have to go." Her mother reached for her hand. "Sweetheart." Claire pulled away, not unkindly, but urgently, and ran. She drove with headlights carving narrow tunnels through the early dark. She called her sister again and again. Voicemail. She felt the loop pressing on her like a deadline with teeth. At 6:05 p.m., she reached her own front door. She didn't go inside. She stood on the porch, keys in hand, breathing hard, waiting for 6:10 like it was a guillotine. When her phone rang at 6:09, Claire almost dropped it. Her sister's name lit the screen. Claire answered, voice raw. "Where are you? What's happening?" Her sister's breath came in uneven bursts. "I've been trying to reach you all day. Mum's test results. Claire, they found something." The words landed like cold metal. Claire felt the world narrow to the sound of her sister's voice, the wind around her, the thud of her own heart. And then, in the strange mercy of the loop, something shifted. Claire didn't say, "I'm busy." She didn't say, "later." She didn't say, "after work." She listened. She asked questions. She stayed on the phone until her sister's breathing slowed, until the panic softened into the fragile plan-making that follows bad news. When the call ended, Claire sat on the porch steps and stared at the winter sky, letting grief and love move through her like weather. At 6:10 p.m., she walked into her kitchen and dropped her keys on the counter. Nothing snapped. The sound echoed once, ordinary and final, and time continued forward. Claire realized then that the loop had not been about preventing death in the street. It had been about preventing a quieter kind of loss, the loss of showing up too late for the people you love. And the question it left behind was simple, almost unbearable. How many laters do we spend before we understand that later is not a promise? What if the loop isn't just a second chance? It's a mirror that shows you the parts of your life you've been refusing to face. A man named Eric noticed the repetition in his own hands. On the first morning, he didn't think much of it. He was shaving, half awake, watching foam gather along his jaw. The razor dragged a little, catching on a spot he'd missed. He rinsed it, stared at his reflection, and tried to ignore the heavy feeling behind his eyes. The second morning, he shaved the same spot again. Same drag, same catch, same small sting on the skin. Eric paused, razor hovering. He looked at the calendar. He checked his phone. The date was the same. He whispered, "No," like the word might undo it. This time, it was the entire day, not a sliver. A full loop, from morning light to the moment he fell asleep. And each reset came with a cruel tenderness. Everything returned to its starting positions, but Eric's memory stayed. At first, he did what most of us would do. He tried to prove it wasn't real. He changed his routine. He called in sick. He drove to a different part of town. He bought different food. He said odd things in conversation just to watch whether the world corrected itself. But the day bent back, stubborn as a river finding its old bed. Eric lived that day like a man pacing a room. And in pacing, he discovered something uncomfortable. He had been pacing his life for years. There were things he avoided by staying busy. He was the kind of person who looked functional from the outside. A job, an apartment, friends he saw occasionally, a practiced smile. But underneath, there was a story he didn't tell. A story he didn't even like to think about. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was unresolved. A guilt that didn't have an end point. It was connected to his father. Not in the obvious way. No sensational family secret. Just a long, slow erosion. A phone call Eric didn't return. A visit he postponed. An argument that ended with silence, because silence was easier than apology. The kind of fracture people carry quietly until time runs out and the fracture becomes permanent. On the first version of the day, Eric received a message he barely looked at. It was from his father. "Call me when you can." Eric read it, felt a flicker of annoyance. Why now? Why always when I'm busy? And then shoved it aside. Later. After work. When I have the energy. When I can be the version of myself that isn't angry. In the loop, the message came again. "Call me when you can." The same words, the same calm tone, the same timestamp. Like time was tapping the same spot on his shoulder. Eric tried to ignore it again, just to see if the day would still reset. It did. That was the difference between chance and instruction. The loop wasn't nudging him toward a random act of kindness. It was dragging him toward a conversation he had been running from for years. But fear is slippery. Even with infinite retries, Eric found ways to delay. He told himself his father would answer later. He told himself he needed to prepare. He told himself he didn't know what to say. He lived the day again and again, becoming hyper-aware of how many small comforts he used to avoid discomfort. He watched himself scroll his phone mindlessly. He watched himself choose work tasks over human tasks. He watched himself fill silence with noise. On the seventh loop, Eric finally called. The phone rang 3 times. His father answered with a voice that sounded older than Eric remembered. "Hey," his father said, cautious, as if afraid this might be a mistake. Eric's throat tightened. For a moment, no words came, just breathing. Then Eric heard himself say, I keep getting the same day, and the only thing that feels like it matters is calling you. There was a pause. Not the kind where someone disconnects, but the kind where someone decides to stay. His father didn't laugh. He didn't question Eric's sanity. He just said quietly, I've been hoping you'd call. Something in Eric cracked open. Not the dramatic shatter of a movie scene, but the slow release of a knot that's been tightened for too long. They didn't solve everything in that conversation. Real life doesn't work that way. But they named the truth, that they'd both been stubborn, both been hurt, both been afraid of admitting they missed each other. Eric apologized. Not perfectly, not poetically, but sincerely. His father apologized too. They talked about small things, weather, a neighbor's dog, an old family story Eric hadn't heard in years. And in those small things, the tension eased, because small things are how love survives after the big things bruise it. When Eric hung up, his hands were shaking. He stared at the phone like it was a relic from another world. He waited for the reset. Night came. He slept. Morning arrived. The calendar had changed. Eric stood in his bathroom with the razor in his hand and felt the quiet shock of a life continuing. The foam gathered. The razor dragged in a slightly different way. The day was new, not because it was different in its details, but because Eric was different in his attention. If loops exist, maybe they don't always exist to rescue us from danger. Maybe they exist to rescue us from postponement. And maybe the most frightening thing about time isn't that it might repeat, but that most of the time it doesn't. What if the loop isn't a message from the universe at all? What if it's the brain, desperate to keep you alive, replaying the moment before it breaks? A teenager named Lily remembered the smell of smoke before she remembered anything else. Not thick smoke, not movie smoke. Just a faint, sour hint in the air, like something electrical warming past the point of safety. It was the kind of scent most people ignore because most people live on the assumption that ordinary days remain ordinary. Lily was home alone after school. Her parents were at work. The house was quiet in that familiar way that can feel either peaceful or lonely depending on the day. She threw her backpack on the floor, microwaved leftovers, and turned on the television without really watching it. Her mind was elsewhere. Friends, homework, the endless ache of growing up and not knowing what parts of you will survive adulthood. Then the smell returned, stronger. She paused mid-bite, listening. A low buzzing sound rose from somewhere in the walls, a tremor like a bee trapped behind drywall. The TV's chatter suddenly felt too loud, too irrelevant. Lily stood and walked down the hall, following the smell like it had a gravity of its own. At the end of the corridor, near a closet she rarely opened, the air grew warmer. The buzzing became sharper, angrier. She reached for the closet door, and the world detonated into light. A flash, a crack, heat so sudden it felt like being shoved. Her ears rang. The hallway filled with a roar that wasn't sound so much as force. She stumbled backward, throat seizing, eyes watering instantly. The closet, something inside the closet, had ignited. Flames climbed with impossible speed, licking the ceiling as if the house were made of dry paper. Panic is not a thought. It's a takeover. Lily turned and ran toward the front door, but smoke poured behind her like a living thing. Her vision narrowed. She coughed and tasted bitterness. She fumbled at the lock with trembling hands, the simple mechanics of escape suddenly complicated by fear. The doorknob was hot, and then she was in the kitchen again. The TV was on. The leftovers sat steaming. The house was quiet. Lily sat perfectly still, fork hovering above the plate, her heart hammering as if it remembered dying. The smell of smoke was faint again, like a whisper. Lily stared at her hands. She flexed her fingers, checking that they existed. She looked down the hall and felt a surge of dread so sharp it made her nauseous. She hadn't imagined it. She had lived it. The heat, the roar, the burning doorknob. Those weren't dream textures. They were reality textures. Time had snapped back. She stood slowly, like any sudden movement might trigger the explosion again. She walked to the hall and listened. The buzzing was there, soft, steady. The smell grew stronger as she approached the closet. This time, she didn't open the door. She backed away and grabbed her phone, fingers slipping on the screen. She called emergency services and forced her voice to stay level. There's a smell of smoke. There's buzzing in the wall. I think something electrical is wrong. I'm home alone. The operator told her to leave the house immediately. Lily ran to the front door before the hallway could fill, before smoke could turn the air into poison. She flung it open and burst outside into cold, clean air that tasted like mercy. She stood on the lawn, shaking, phone pressed to her ear, watching her house like it was an animal she didn't fully trust anymore. Minutes later, the fire arrived anyway. Smaller than before, because she wasn't trapped inside it. A hiss of smoke from a window, a flicker behind glass. Then firefighters, swift and practiced, containing what could have become a catastrophe. Neighbors gathered, wrapped in coats, eyes wide, mouths forming silent questions. Lily's parents arrived, faces pale with terror and disbelief. Everyone said the same things people always say after disaster is narrowly avoided. Thank God, you're okay. That could have been so much worse. Lily nodded, but inside she carried a private knowledge. It had been worse. In a version of the day no one else remembered, she had felt the doorknob burn. She had breathed the smoke. She had reached the edge of something final. And then time, whether through physics or the mind's emergency machinery or some unnameable mercy, had offered her a reset. Afterward, Lily struggled to explain it even to herself. Some nights she woke up smelling smoke that wasn't there. Some days she flinched at buzzing lights. She began to understand that survival isn't always clean. Sometimes it leaves a shadow, a second timeline your body keeps, even when the world moves on. But it also left her with a strange gratitude, not the loud gratitude of slogans, but the quiet gratitude of attention. The knowledge that ordinary moments are not guaranteed to stay ordinary. The awareness that small warnings can be life-saving if you listen to them early. If a loop can happen inside a burning hallway, then maybe the boundary between before and after is thinner than we think. And maybe the real question isn't whether time can repeat. Maybe the question is, when your life whispers a warning, through a smell, a feeling, a sudden certainty, do you trust it enough to act before the flames appear? What if the loop doesn't ask you to save a stranger, or call a family member, or dodge an accident? What if it asks you to forgive yourself? A man named Andrew didn't believe in second chances, not in the sentimental way, not in the clean, movie script way where you apologize and everyone hugs and the world softens into resolution. Andrew believed in consequences. He believed in them because he carried one. Years earlier, he had been driving home late at night when his phone buzzed. He told himself he'd only glance. Just a second, just enough to see who it was. That single glance became a gap in attention wide enough for disaster to enter. A pedestrian, a sudden shape in the headlights, a sickening impact, a scream that might have been his own, and then sirens and hands and lights, and a courtroom where words like accident sounded too gentle for what had happened. He didn't escape punishment. He didn't escape guilt. He served time. He paid money. He lost relationships. But the heaviest sentence was internal, a memory that replayed without mercy. The night it happened became his private loop, one he revisited in his mind until it wore grooves in his soul. Then, on an ordinary evening years later, time made the replay literal. Andrew was driving again. Same kind of late hour, same quiet roads, the streetlights spaced like punctuation. He wasn't reckless anymore. He drove carefully, rigidly, as if caution could rewrite the past. His phone buzzed, his whole body tensed, like he'd been struck. He didn't touch the phone. He didn't even look at it. He kept his eyes on the road, hands steady on the wheel. And then the pedestrian appeared, the same shape in the headlights, the same suddenness, the same impossible demand. React now. Andrew slammed the brakes. The tires screamed. The car jolted. The pedestrian stumbled but didn't fall. He looked up, startled, then hurried across, vanishing into darkness. Andrew pulled over, shaking so hard his teeth rattled. Tears came without warning. He pressed his forehead against the steering wheel, breathing like someone who had just been underwater too long. He whispered, "I didn't do it," as if he needed to convince the universe. Then, he was back on the same stretch of road again. The streetlights, the quiet, the phone buzz. Andrew's blood ran cold. He stared at the phone as if it were a snake. He looked at the time. It was the same minute. He drove forward, dread building. He knew what was coming. He knew the shape of the night, like someone who'd studied a crime scene. The pedestrian appeared again. Andrew braked again. The pedestrian survived again. Then, with a cruel precision, the world reset again. Andrew lived that loop more times than he could count comfortably. The phone buzzed. The pedestrian appeared. He braked. The person lived. Reset. At first, the loop felt like punishment, a cosmic taunt. You will relive your worst moment forever. But slowly, something changed. Andrew began to notice details he'd never noticed in his original tragedy. The pedestrian wasn't the same person. The street wasn't identical. The loop wasn't a perfect recreation. It was an echo, close enough to stab, different enough to matter. This wasn't about repeating the past. It was about meeting it. On one loop, Andrew pulled over before the pedestrian even appeared. He got out of the car and stood on the roadside under a streetlight that made his shadow long and thin. He stared at the empty road ahead, heart pounding, feeling ridiculous. When the pedestrian finally emerged, this time a young man in a hoodie, earbuds in, eyes down, Andrew stepped forward and called out, "Hey!" The young man paused, annoyed. "What?" Andrew's voice cracked. "Please, just look up when you cross, please." The young man frowned, then glanced at the road, then nodded with a shrug that suggested he didn't understand the weight behind Andrew's plea. He crossed more carefully and disappeared into the dark. The loop reset again. Andrew realized then that the loop wasn't satisfied with mere avoidance. It wanted something deeper than survival. It wanted intention. It wanted repair. But how do you repair what can't be repaired? You can't unbreak a life. You can't uncrack a moment. You can't walk into the past and put everything back the way it was. So Andrew did the only thing available. He began to act in the present like someone who understood the value of attention. He stopped wherever he saw people crossing recklessly. He rolled down his window and asked them to be careful, not with anger, but with urgency. He flashed his headlights early. He used his horn not as an insult, but as a signal. He became, strangely, painfully, a guardian for the kind of moment he had once ruined. And still the loop continued. Until one loop, after the pedestrian crossed safely, Andrew didn't drive on. He stayed parked. He turned off the engine. He sat in the dark and listened to his own breathing. He spoke aloud, quietly, as if addressing someone who might still hear him. "I'm sorry," he said. "I can't change what I did, but I can keep choosing differently now." He waited. And for the first time, the world didn't reset. Andrew drove home under streetlights that felt less like judgment and more like passage. He didn't feel absolved. The past didn't vanish. But something loosened inside him, like a hand unclenching. If time loops are real, maybe they don't always offer the fantasy of undoing. Maybe they offer something harder, the chance to live with what you've done without letting it make you numb. Because forgiveness isn't the erasure of consequence. It's the decision to keep living responsibly after consequence has landed. And the question Andrew carried into the next day wasn't about whether he deserved the loop. It was about what we all deserve. If you could relive your worst moment, not to escape it, but to learn from it, what kind of person would you choose to become? What if the loop isn't a mystery to solve, but a lens showing us how thin the line is between normal and unthinkable? There's a quiet pattern running through stories like these. Some are about danger avoided at the last second. Some are about a message finally answered. Some are about an act of kindness that becomes the key that unlocks tomorrow. But beneath the different settings, train platforms, mountain trails, suburban kitchens, empty roads, there's a shared sensation. The feeling of being singled out by time. Not chosen in a heroic way, chosen in a vulnerable way. Because to remember a loop is to carry a burden no one else shares. You become the only witness to a reality that keeps disappearing. You become the only person who knows how close the world came to breaking. And you have to decide what to do with that knowledge while everyone else keeps walking forward, unaware. In one sense, these stories are about time. In another sense, they're about attention. A loop, whether it's an actual fracture in the fabric of hours or a psychological phenomenon shaped by stress, trauma, or memory, forces attention in a way ordinary life rarely does. It magnifies patterns. It turns background details into foreground signals. It makes you notice the human beings around you, not as scenery, but as lives with trajectories. It also exposes something we don't like to admit. We repeat ourselves constantly without realizing it. We repeat habits. We repeat arguments. We repeat avoidance. We repeat the same day in a subtler way. Waking up, hurrying, reacting, numbing, postponing, until years pass, and we wonder how we arrived at the life we're living. And unlike the dramatic loops, most of our repetitions don't come with a reset button. They come with accumulation. A harsh word said too often becomes a relationship that feels unsafe. A call not returned becomes a distance that hardens. A risk ignored becomes a tragedy that doesn't rewind. A small act of attention, practiced daily, becomes a life that feels sturdier. So when we listen to accounts of time repeating, part of what we're listening to is our own hunger for revision. The human wish quietly held to step back into a moment and do it better. But there's a paradox here. If a loop gave you infinite attempts, you might treat life like a game, trial and error, consequences that don't stick. Yet in the stories, the opposite often happens. The loop doesn't make people careless, it makes them reverent. It makes them understand that a single choice can hold an entire future inside it, even if nobody claps when you make the right one. Some people who describe loops say the experience left them more compassionate. They began to notice strangers. They began to speak up when something felt wrong. They began to show up for loved ones with less delay. They began to live with the awareness that the ordinary world is stitched together by countless small moments that could unravel. Others describe something darker: anxiety, hypervigilance, a lingering fear that reality could snap back at any time. They became obsessed with control because the loop had shown them how little control we truly have. Both reactions make sense, because the loop, if it exists, is a confrontation with uncertainty. It tells you that time, this thing we build our identities around, might not always behave the way we assume. And when the ground beneath your assumptions shakes, you either learn to walk differently or you fall. Maybe the safest way to hold these stories is not to treat them as proof of cosmic mechanics, but as mirrors of human experience. We know, scientifically, that memory is not a perfect recording. It's a reconstruction, shaped by emotion, expectation, and the brain's need to make meaning. We know trauma can warp time perception, stretching seconds into eternities, collapsing hours into blanks. We know déjà vu can make a new moment feel like an old one, and that the mind sometimes misfiles now as remembered. And yet, even if every loop story were ultimately explainable by the brain, the human core remains. People experience something that shakes them awake. They are forced to look at their lives with fresh eyes. They are given, in some form, the sense of another chance. Maybe that's why these accounts endure. Not because they prove time is broken, but because they reveal what we would do if we believed we could try again. Would we be kinder? Would we be braver? Would we finally stop postponing the conversation that could change everything? If there's a message inside the mystery, it might be this: even without a literal loop, we are constantly offered moments that resemble second chances, not as rewinds, but as repetitions, daily opportunities to choose differently in the patterns we keep reliving. And if tomorrow arrives without a reset, the question becomes the one time asked every person who ever believed they got another shot. What will you do with the day that doesn't repeat? What if the most important time loop isn't the one you experience, but the one you never notice you're living? By the end of every loop story, there's a moment that feels almost unfair in its simplicity. The day finally changes. A new morning arrives, a clock advances, the air tastes slightly different, and the person who lived the repetition steps into forward motion with a new kind of silence inside them. Not because they have answers, but because they've seen how fragile the ordinary is. That fragility is the real thread tying these accounts together. Whether a loop is a glitch in physics, a trick of perception, a survival mechanism in the brain, or something stranger, it carries the same emotional message. The future is not a smooth continuation of the present. It is a series of narrow bridges, each one built from small choices we don't always notice while we're crossing. We want to believe life is made of big moments, grand decisions, dramatic turns, the day everything changes. But the loop stories suggest something more quietly radical. Life is shaped by the moments we treat as minor. A step closer to the platform edge, a glance at a phone while driving, a call postponed until later, a stranger's need we don't see because we're busy being ourselves, a warning smells in the air, a second of hesitation that saves a life, a breath taken before an apology, a hand reaching out in time. The loop forces that truth into sharp focus because it turns the minor into the only thing that matters. It makes you live the same minute until you recognize the meaning hidden inside it. And when you finally act, when you finally see, the loop releases you, as if time itself was never trying to punish you, only to teach you how to pay attention. But here's the harder thought. Most of us will never get a literal loop. We won't be returned to the morning to undo the harsh sentence we said in anger. We won't wake up again on the day we missed the last chance to visit someone we loved. We won't re-enter the intersection with the foreknowledge to brake sooner. In real life, the film keeps running. So why do these stories matter? Because they offer, in metaphor or in mystery, what ordinary life often fails to offer: perspective without catastrophe. A loop is what we wish we could have when we regret something. A chance to try again, to do better, to rescue someone, to rescue ourselves. Listening to these accounts, we can feel that wish rise in us, not as fantasy, but as longing for the kind of attention that would prevent regret in the first place. And maybe that longing is the point. Maybe the time loop is a symbol for the human condition. We repeat patterns until we learn. We relive the same arguments in different forms until we finally listen. We chase the same distractions until we admit what we're trying to avoid. We fall into the same traps until we recognize the trap is made from our own unexamined habits. In that sense, the loop isn't supernatural. It's psychological. It's spiritual. It's the way life teaches. We don't usually get a rewind, but we do get repetition. We get morning after morning to practice being the person we want to become. We get countless small intersections where a better choice is possible, not because time resets, but because time continues and offers new versions of the same lesson. The question, then, is not whether time can loop. The question is whether we can. Can we loop through our days with more awareness? Can we notice the people who share space with us? Can we choose patience over reflex, presence over hurry, honesty over postponement? Can we treat ordinary moments as the places where meaning hides, waiting to be seen? Because one day, quietly, without warning, the loop ends for all of us, not with a snap back to morning, but with the simple finality of no more mornings. And when that day comes, what will matter isn't whether we solved the mystery of time. What will matter is whether we used the time we had to be awake inside it. So if you ever feel a strange familiarity in a moment, if you ever sense, for no clear reason, that you should slow down, look up, call someone, pull over, speak gently, consider this. Maybe you don't need proof of a loop to act as if you've been given another chance. Maybe the greatest second chance is the one happening right now, in the unrepeatable day you're living. And if that's true, then the most timeless question of all is simple. What will you do differently while you still can?